everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome back to the Hilltop and the Center for Presidential History. My name is Jeffrey Engel. I have the honor of directing that center, and therefore I have the honor of kicking off tonight's festivities, which I'm really, really excited about. Before I get to that, I just want to remind you of a couple more things that we have on our calendar that you might want to have on your radar. Most specifically, we still have a few slots available for our upcoming World War I trip through France. It's going to be next June. If you want to go on a trip that has a disturbingly high historian to traveler ratio, this would be a good trip for you. And also, I want to point out, if you're interested in more of what we're doing, we're expanding our Article 2 Society, which is our donor supportive society, and I offer you the opportunity to please check out our website and take a look at that. There are some interesting opportunities there for ways to further engage our students, further engage our graduate students and our fellows, and really help us shape the future of the center, which, as you know, is a question that needs shaping, since you're all, I'm sure, completely aware that this is our 10th anniversary year. And so, I encourage you in March to mark your calendars for March 7th, thank you, March 7th for our big event, which is going to be over in McFarland. It's going to be bigger than any Tate you ever went to. And better, I might add. So keep your eyes out for that. But that's not why we're here tonight. We're here tonight to listen to somebody who I'm really excited to listen to. Now, Nicole Hemmer, who is of Vanderbilt University, is the kind of person that if I went and started to list all the different things that she has done and that she is credited for, I would consume all of her time. So I'll just give you a brief highlight of words, which is to say, she's an innovator as a podcaster, she's a columnist, she's a historian, she runs a center. I'm not done yet. She directed an oral history project, and by the way, that was going to be out very soon, I think, with amazing results of the Obama administration. And I could go on and on and on. There is actually no one who I can think of who is better positioned, I think, to be the voice of, this is going to embarrass us both, the voice of your generation. Than Nikki. And one quick anecdote about that, as Nikki may wish to say a little bit more, Vanderbilt has a new Center for Studying the Presidency, and they have chosen as its founding director Professor Nicole Hemmer. And when I first heard about this center, you may not know this about me, I'm actually a very competitive person. And I heard there was going to be another presidential center of some kind, and it kind of got my dander up. And I said, A, what the heck? And B, why didn't they ask us first? And then when I heard who they chose as director, I said, now it makes sense, because now I know it's going to be a good thing. So if you would please join me in welcoming my good friend, Professor Nicole Hemmer.
Jeff heard that they chose me, and he was like, oh, no competition, it's fine. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm going to talk tonight about my new book, Partisans, which you can see up there on the screen. I'll give you an overview of the book and then dive into one of my favorite parts of it that has been largely overlooked in the reviews, so I'm going to force people to confront it. But I want to start with Pat Buchanan, who you can see here on the cover of the book. The greatest vacuum in American politics is to the right of Ronald Reagan. That was the observation Pat Buchanan made in January 1987, as he was planning on exiting the Reagan administration and entering the 1988 Republican presidential primary. Buchanan had the unusual experience of serving both as Reagan's communications director and as one of his biggest critics, clashing roles that would soon lead him to leave the administration. And a week or so later, Buchanan decided to test whether he was right, whether that vacuum to the right of Reagan was ready to be filled. A few dozen people packed into Buchanan's living room to discuss the feasibility of a presidential run. Howard Phillips, another right-wing Reagan critic, had been prodding Buchanan for months to run, as had his sister, who would become his campaign manager, Babe Buchanan. But it was right-wing columnist John Lofton who offered the most memorable endorsement that night. After hearing that Buchanan planned to run, he let out a loud whoop and said, "Let the bloodbath begin." Enthusiastic as the shouted endorsement was, it was also a sign that even Buchanan's boosters saw him as a spoiler, not a winner. He had unusually high name recognition because of his time on PBS and CNN, but more people viewed Buchanan unfavorably than favorably, even when pollsters limited their pool to independents and Republicans. His television career meant a lot of people knew who he was. It also meant a lot of people didn't like him very much. So Buchanan decided to wait. He figured that Ronald Reagan loomed too large, that attacking Reagan's politics and his legacy in 1988, one of the high points of his popularity, would end in disaster. After all, Reagan had won back-to-back landslide elections, and he was leaving office with one of the highest approval ratings in modern US history. And Buchanan was right in his timing, because after Reagan left, George H.W. Bush, his vice president, won in yet another landslide. By 1992, 4 years later, however, things had changed. Conservatives had held the presidency for 12 years, and they were furious. Their chosen presidents had not transformed the country. Instead, the right discovered that the presidency was a site of compromise, one that relied on building and maintaining national majorities. Such compromises were anathema to a conservative movement that was increasingly concerned with political purity and partisan warfare. A right-wing populist insurgency was bubbling up, one which rejected the politics of both President Bush and President Reagan. This new post-Reagan right set its sights on Congress instead, building a new conservative movement in the 1990s that would not start at the presidential level and trickle down, but boil up from Congress and conservative media. And it's this post-Cold War right that is the subject of my new book, Partisans. In it, I argue that nearly as soon as Ronald Reagan left office, his influence on the party began to wane, that leading figures on the right began rejecting core parts of his politics. I argue that Reaganism, which was the label that was given to his political and rhetorical approach as president, could only exist in a Cold War context. So it should come as no surprise that when the Cold War ended, the right left Reaganism behind. Except that comes as a huge surprise. Reagan looms so large in conservative mythology and historiography that it has been difficult even for historians to notice his eclipse. Princeton historian Sean Wilentz named the stretch of decades from the mid-1970s to the mid-2000s the age of Reagan, and many other historians have agreed. But in making Reaganism and conservatism synonymous, political historians have missed how radically the right changed in the 1990s. The Reagan myth would only grow in those years, but many conservatives would become Reaganites in name only. So why did a significant portion of the right leave Reagan behind? The end of the Cold War was a major factor. Ronald Reagan was a Cold War president. Go here. There he is. Ronald Reagan was a Cold War president. His conservatism was conditioned by that geopolitical reality. It shaped, for instance, the centrality of democracy to his rhetoric as president. And this was pretty easy for Reagan. He won back-to-back landslide elections, made it pretty clear to him that there was wisdom in the majority. He laced his speeches with appeals to democracy, presenting it, as all Cold War presidents did, as the antithesis to communism. The Cold War also conditioned Reagan's support for certain policies. He saw free trade, open immigration, and global engagement as the answer to the closed systems of communism. This is why he proposed the North America Accord, a forerunner to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which would have created an open trade and immigration zone with Mexico and Canada. It's something he proposed when he was running for president in 1980. His rhetoric on immigration was welcoming, as were the policies that he pursued. And while Reagan had opposed the major civil rights legislation of the 1960s and developed policies that disproportionately harmed Black Americans, he embraced the ideas of diversity and equality as positive political values that the United States should pursue. With the end of the Cold War, the underlying logic for all of these positions disappeared. The rapidly changing conditions of geopolitics created space for a new set of right-wing politics that had no need to embrace democracy or diversity or international engagement. And it was into that space, into that vacuum, to the right of Ronald Reagan, that the America First grievance politics of Pat Buchanan flowed. So Buchanan serves as one of the main characters of Partisans, the politician who, in repeated presidential runs, served as a touchstone for this new post-Cold War, post-Reagan right. In Partisans, I show how Buchanan developed a far more pessimistic, more nationalistic, and more overtly racist politics in the 1990s. And I want to show you how different Ronald Reagan and Pat Buchanan sounded, even just a few years apart. So this is Ronald Reagan talking about democracy in 1984. He said, "Democracy is worth dying for because it's the most deeply honorable form of government ever devised by man." Just 7 years later, this is what Pat Buchanan was saying about democracy at a moment that was seen as the height of democratic triumphalism in the wake of the Cold War. The American press is infatuated to the point of intoxication with democracy. If the people are corrupt, the more democracy, the worse the government. In this column, he would go on to praise autocracy as an ideal form of government. It was more efficient, it was more effective. And when they talked about immigration, they sounded pretty different as well. So Ronald Reagan, speaking at a naturalization ceremony in 1984, said this about immigration and its relationship to the United States. "Academics talk about assimilation and how our various ethnic groups have, with time, dropped their ethnicity and become more American. I think it's really closer to the truth to say America has assimilated as much as her immigrants have. It's made for a delightful diversity, and it's made us a stronger and more vital nation." Pat Buchanan, just 6 years later, had this to say. "Does the first world nation wish to become a third world country? Because that is our destiny if we do not build a seawall against the waves of immigration rolling over our shores." And I point this out not to rehabilitate Reagan's reputation, but to show how quickly right-wing politics were shifting in the 1990s. And it wasn't just Reagan's politics that were shifting, Pat Buchanan's politics were shifting as well. I can show you an article that Pat Buchanan wrote in the 1980s where he was talking about what he called undocumented immigrants as a real boon to the United States, as people who were providing necessary labor, who paid payroll taxes and sales taxes, who didn't rely on the government for extra help. And yes, it was true that he was using undocumented immigrants to make the case that Black people were lazy welfare cheats, but that idea that he could call on undocumented immigrants in that way, and then just a few years later call for a border wall, was a big shift that was helped along by the end of the Cold War. When it came to democracy, when it came to immigration, Buchanan in the 1990s painted a very different vision for the United States. And it was a vision that wasn't exclusive to Buchanan. It would flourish on the right in the aftermath of the Cold War. There were other changes, too, that shaped the new right-wing politics of the post-Reagan era. The media environment was rapidly changing as talk radio, cable, and soon the internet helped to create a media landscape that was far more interactive than what came before. The profusion of new media also fractured and fragmented the media landscape. And that shifted the incentives for news and politics programming away from the mass audiences and majority messaging of network news to increasingly micro-targeted programming that sought to shock and entertain as much as persuade and inform. The other major shift came in the nature of national politics. Once obsessed with the presidency, conservatives during the 1990s shifted their attention to Congress. And there were good reasons for this. For one, they were deeply disappointed in the limited gains of the Bush and Reagan administrations. For another, Republicans had captured the majority in the House for the first time in 40 years. And they had done so by nationalizing the election. But importantly, they were nationalizing district-level races, not focusing on the national election of one presidential candidate. That meant that their candidates didn't need to appeal to a broad, diverse national electorate, but rather had to turn out devoted activists at the local level. And that allowed these nationalized congressional elections to select much more conservative candidates than at the presidential level. The story that emerges from all of these different strands fundamentally shifts our understanding of the 1990s. The decade, so often described as an era of intense political polarization, was actually an era of right-wing radicalization. The Democratic Party didn't run away from the Republican Party during the 1990s. The Democratic Party moved to the right on a wide swath of policy issues. But the Republican Party moved even further, adopting what were once far-right positions on issues like guns and immigration. Conservatives also began to paint Democrats not as opponents, but as enemies, and adopted radical procedural obstruction with extended government shutdowns, congressional investigations, and ultimately presidential impeachment. So that is the kind of broad swath of the book, but what I'd like to talk about today is one aspect of the book that I think shows all of these trends that were happening in the 1990s. And it starts with one of the central political archetypes of the decade, the angry white male. The phrase angry white male first appears in US newspapers in 1990, and it appears pretty much everywhere. By the middle of the decade, it was ubiquitous among political journalists and campaign professionals. Now, to be sure, 1990 was not the first year that white men felt politically frustrated. By the 1970s, there was a clear cohort of white men who believed that economic shifts, liberation movements, and affirmative action had all contributed to a genuine loss of both economic resources and cultural status. But it was in the 1990s that those white men got noticeably angrier. Another 20 years of economic decline, plus right-wing political organizing, had sharpened white men's rage. And journalists were paying attention, finding the angry white male listening to Rush Limbaugh's radio show, attending Pat Buchanan's campaign rallies, and enrolling in local militias. So let me stress this. There was an economic component to the sense of dislocation that many white men felt. But their anger was also a product of the process of radicalization that was taking place in Republican politics, right-wing media, and far-right organizing. By the late 1990s, the angry white male would be replaced by the soccer mom as the political archetype that pundits obsessed over. But that shift in focus from men to women disguises both the persistence of white male frustrations and the women who spoke for the angry white male in the 1990s. Women, in fact, were some of the most important conduits of right-wing radicalism in the 1990s. They served as both translators and legitimators of male anger, but also as part of a broader anti-feminism on the right. And it's that anti-feminism that I want to talk about. Anti-feminists in the 1990s were a coalition of different groups. There are the anti-feminist women that I'm going to be talking about today, but also men's rights activists and conservative evangelical Christians. Men's rights activism had been around for a few decades. It gets its start in the 1960s and 1970s. But in the 1990s, it took a sharp turn toward a more explicitly anti-woman politics. That new men's rights politics was exemplified in the 1993 book, The Myth of Male Power by Warren Farrell, which argued that men were systematically disadvantaged and powerless in US society. and that there were white evangelical Christians, including groups like Concerned Women for America, who continued to organize around traditional gender roles in ways that they had been doing since, well, in particularly active ways since the 60s and 70s, and in other ways for hundreds of years. But these two groups, men's rights activists and evangelical Christians, tended not to dominate the anti-feminist discourse of the 1990s. Rather, it was a group of non-traditional women anti-feminists who thrived in the decade. They were able to do so because of the particular media environment in which they operated, one that was fascinated with the unexpected and with the politics of contradiction. So seeing images of men wielding firearms was something Americans were accustomed to. Seeing women doing it was something intriguing. Men arguing against sexual harassment policies were considered retrograde. Women doing so were considered novel. Like male pundits and politicians, the more outrageous and radical women anti-feminists seemed, the more of a platform they gained. But unlike men, their radicalism was presented as amusing and harmless, making it more palatable. Anti-feminists in the 1990s looked very different from those that came before them. Anti-feminist women in the Cold War era tended to engage in housewife activism. I say housewife activists not because these women primarily worked raising their families, a number of them were professional political operatives, but because that's how they styled themselves. Women like Phyllis Schlafly, who fought against the Equal Rights Amendment, Anita Bryant, who fought against gay rights, and Louisa Day Hicks, who fought against school desegregation, all positioned themselves as mothers protecting children and other women. They may have been active in the public sphere, but they used the home and notions of motherhood as their source of authority. In Schlafly's case, this identity was deliberately developed in response to second-wave feminism. She rejected women's political and economic equality with men, and also rejected women's liberation from traditional gender expectations around work, appearance, and sexuality. Feminism, Schlafly argued, did not rescue women, it harmed them. Equal rights meant loss of privileges. Women would be drafted into the military. They would lose their rights to alimony payments. They would no longer be covered by protective labor legislation. The anti-feminists of the 1990s were different. They looked very different, they acted very different, they believed different things. Women like Ann Coulter, Laura Ingraham, and Kellyanne Fitzpatrick, all very popular pundits in the 1990s, had absorbed the victories of second-wave feminism. They built ambitious careers as lawyers, lobbyists, writers. They wore power suits and miniskirts, worked in white shoe law firms, and clerked for Supreme Court justices. Like Schlafly and other Cold War anti-feminists, the core of their politics was reactionary. But they organized in revolt to third-wave feminism, particularly its concerns with sexual harassment, inclusive language, and gender-based legislation like the Violence Against Women Act. And rather than arguing that they were protecting other women, increasingly they argued that they were protecting men, feminism's true victims. Take, for instance, the Independent Women's Forum. The Independent Women's Forum emerges in the 1990s. It becomes the main organization for women anti-feminists in the decade. And it begins in 1991 as the ad hoc group Women for Judge Thomas. Women for Judge Thomas was created by a group of women who were mostly friends and former clerks for Clarence Thomas. They sought to counter women's groups who opposed the conservative justices' nomination to the Supreme Court. They became much more important in the debate after Anita Hill came forward to testify that Thomas had sexually harassed her. The women of Women for Judge Thomas believed that as women, they could be an effective counterweight to Anita Hill's testimony. In the years that followed, the group broadened its mission to act as a counterweight to liberal feminism and renamed itself the Independent Women's Forum. Though it was a small group with about 600 members by the mid-1990s, In media coverage, it was the go-to counterpoint to the National Organization for Women, which was the liberal group with hundreds of thousands of members. Journalists presented the Independent Women's Forum as now's conservative equivalent, which suggested that the forum had a stature and influence far beyond that which it had actually demonstrated. And this is the result of a kind of both sides approach to political journalism, that this tiny group could be seen as just as influential as an organization like Now. Conservative anti-feminism in the 1990s, though, was not limited just to the IWF. It also had representation in Congress, most significantly with Helen Chenoweth. Chenoweth was elected to Congress as a representative from Idaho in 1994 during that year's massive Republican wave in the midterm elections. She was one of the few Republican women in this new freshman class, but she would become known as one of the most radical members of a radical Congress, and as a spokesperson for the angry white male of the 1990s. Chenoweth was particularly concerned with the white men of the Northwest and the way environmental legislation threatened jobs like logging, grazing, and farming. She traced her political origins to the 1964 Wilderness Act, a piece of legislation that designated millions of acres of Western land as wilderness. And that designation also sharply limited the logging, grazing, and mining that could be done on those lands, something that Chenoweth saw as a direct attack on both the economy and the culture of the West. It was when she decided to run for office in 1994 that she shifted men to the center of her analysis. On the campaign trail, she wore a t-shirt with a picture of a male farmer and a cowboy and the words, "Idaho's endangered species." Elsewhere on the trail, she declared, "It's the Anglo-Saxon male that's endangered today." With rhetoric like that, Chenoweth quickly became the face of a movement symbolized by men and masculinity. Cowboys, loggers, ranch hands, miners. And not that men were the only ones in those occupations. Chenoweth organized women ranchers and loggers as part of her campaign. But the face of these industries had long been white men. And that was especially true for the politics of this area, particularly the Sagebrush Rebellion, a movement that developed in the 1970s. The Sagebrush Rebellion was an effort to open up federal lands and roll back environmental regulations. It was one of those things that caught the attention of Ronald Reagan as he was preparing to run for president in 1980. He identified as a sagebrush rebel. And yet for all of the energy that the Sagebrush Rebellion had in the 1970s, it had kind of petered out by the middle of Ronald Reagan's presidency. But while that movement faded, the anger in the West did not. In the 1990s, it came roaring back as the War on the West, a more militant and better-funded movement now amplified through right-wing talk radio and through advocates like Chenoweth in Congress. Chenoweth, though, seldom sounded angry. Her rhetoric was outrageous, not straightforwardly enraged. She often delivered her lines dripping in satire and mockery. She held endangered salmon bakes on the campaign trail to mock the Endangered Species Act. She insisted on being called Congressman. This was partly a jab at feminists who had lobbied for more inclusive language. But interestingly, it was also threaded through with a light feminist critique of its own. In an interview on Pat Robertson's 700 Club, she claimed to use the title because Congressman commanded a respect that Congresswoman did not. Co-opting feminist language and arguments turned out to be a pretty popular technique among anti-feminist women in the 1990s. They particularly enjoyed using it to promote right-wing policies. Unlike conservative evangelical women, their main focus wasn't the issue of abortion, but rather the increasingly polarizing issue of guns. So gun regulation becomes a national political issue in the early 1990s. There are two big pieces of legislation that are responsible for that. The Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, which required background checks and a waiting period for gun sales, and the 1994 federal assault weapons ban, which prohibited some semi-automatic weapons and large capacity magazines. Responses to these two pieces of legislation polarized the gun debate, turning it into both an absolutist cause and a partisan one. As it did, interestingly, we'll bring Ronald Reagan back into the story. Ronald Reagan was at odds with his party when it came to guns. Ronald Reagan was in support of both bills. He even came out in the New York Times for the Brady Bill, understandably, because the Brady Bill is named after his press secretary who was not fatally but seriously wounded in the assassination attempt against Reagan. But he also came out in support of the federal assault weapons ban. The National Rifle Association, on the other hand, came out against both. And in that fight, it was the NRA that won the soul of the Republican Party. The NRA also changed its tactics in the middle of this debate. It used to fund not Democrats and Republicans equally, but it gave a large amount of money to the Democratic Party. As a result of this conflict between this conflict over these two pieces of legislation, the NRA shifts its funding almost entirely to Republicans and increasingly was targeting Republican primaries so that any Republican who was for gun regulation would be defeated at the primary level. In the fight over the two bills, the GOP and the conservative movement became increasingly tied to absolutist policies on gun deregulation and gun rights. It became a central cultural issue as well for both Chenoweth and the women of the Independent Women's Forum. These women presented gun rights and gun ownership as a more legitimate form of feminism than, say, legislation to prevent rape and domestic violence. Laura Ingraham made just that argument in a 1996 piece in the Wall Street Journal. She wrote in Why Feminists Should Be Trigger Happy, Smith & Wesson and the National Rifle Association are doing more to take back the night than the National Organization for Women and Emily's List. She ended the column with a call for more women to take up arms. And that led a few months later to an event at a Maryland gun range called Annie Get Your Gun Permit. There, IWF members like Ingraham and Ann Coulter practiced skeet shooting in front of journalists who eagerly covered the event. Chenoweth played with the same kind of language in her push for unrestricted access to guns. In the mid-1990s, she proposed repealing a law that prevented people convicted of domestic violence from owning guns. As she did, she used gender to deflect the criticisms that her proposed law would almost certainly harm women. She called a press conference featuring women gun activists, and it included the president of Women Against Gun Control, whose motto was, "The Second Amendment is the Equal Rights Amendment." In other words, women did not need a constitutional guarantee of equal rights. To be equal to men, they just needed equivalent firepower. In addition to calling for gun deregulation, Chenoweth made common cause and political connections with the most avidly pro-gun constituency in the country, the militia movement. The militia movement grew rapidly in the 1990s. It was made up of armed groups who ran drills and practiced for imminent revolution. For some, this was a revolution against the government and federal agents. For others, it was a race war. And here I want to note, not only did many of the militias declare a revolt against the federal government in the 1990s, but about 20 to 30% of militia members were women. These militias shared a belief that the US government and supranational organizations like the United Nations were preparing to strip Americans of their sovereignty. And notably, many of them organized at the end of the Reagan administration, believing that he had not done enough to protect their rights. Reagan may have declared that government was the problem, but for the militias, government was the enemy. Militias were attracted to Chenoweth for more than just her devoted advocacy of guns. She embraced many of the militia movement's theories and conspiracies about government. She spread conspiracy theories about black helicopters and the United Nations taking over the country's national parks. She promoted the constitutional sheriff's movement, which argued federal agents had no legitimacy or power that was not explicitly granted to them by local sheriffs. Because of these actions, a local newspaper branded her the poster child for the militias. The militia movement agreed. The militia of Montana, one of the most notorious militias of the era, issued a catalog that sold VHS tapes of Chenoweth's speeches next to bomb-making manuals. And while Chenoweth distanced herself from the most overtly violent parts of the movement, she held that militias were noble and legitimate organizations. And Chenoweth was not the only advocate for militias in Congress. Other Western Republicans like Linda Smith of Washington and Steve Stockman of Texas promoted the groups. They spoke at militia conferences, they used militia members as campaign volunteers, and they defended militias against federal investigation. Those ties came under intense scrutiny just 3 months after Chenoweth entered Congress. In April 1995, 2 men with close ties to the militia and white power movements detonated 4,800 pounds of explosives outside a federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. For Chenoweth, the bombing was an opportunity to show that she would not bow to public pressure. She continued to support the militia movement, and while she denounced the bombing, she suggested that the federal government shared the blame for it. We still must begin to look at the public policies that may be pushing people too far, she said in the wake of the attack. And as a result, was Chenoweth shunned from polite society? No, she found herself with a new national platform. She received invitations to appear on Face the Nation and the network news, and garnered mentions in all of the major newspapers. Ties to extremists led to Chenoweth's not being ignored as a fringe figure, but rather spotlighted as somebody unusual, intriguing, and insightful. Chenoweth leveraged that journalistic bias to great effect, becoming an increasingly influential Republican lawmaker. It's easy to see Chenoweth and the women of the IWF as a model for Republican women who followed, including national figures like Michelle Bachmann and Sarah Palin. And because the 1990s were actually only 2 or 3 decades ago, there are plenty of anti-feminist women who made their names in the 1990s who continue to wield power today. Kellyanne Fitzpatrick, who would become Kellyanne Conway when she married, became Donald Trump's campaign manager and then a senior advisor. Laura Ingraham is now a Fox News star, and Coulter is a leading figure in the nativist right. These women played a central role in pulling the Republican Party to the right and lashing it to radical movements. They shaped a new generation of right-wing punditry and helped move the party away from the Reaganism of the 1980s toward a more pessimistic, nativist, and martial politics. They are important not only because they were women doing that work, but because they manipulated gender expectations in anti-feminist politics to make their radicalism more palatable, intriguing, and popular. And their activism also helps us see that when it comes to the right and presidential politics, the presidency has been a lagging indicator. Ronald Reagan became president only after decades of a conservative movement developing during the Cold War that helped bring him into office. Donald Trump became president only after years of political radicalism had transformed the party. That transformation and its timing is essential to understanding the Trump presidency, which so often has been treated as a dramatic rupture with the party's past. But as Partisans shows, his election was the culmination of the party's radicalization, which had been underway for a quarter century, and which also suggests that the next phase of conservative politics, one that moves past Trumpism, is already underway. Thanks.
That was wonderful. Thank you. As always, we have time for questions, and Professor Hemmer will run the Q&A herself. But if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, we'll bring the mic to you. And please wait for the mic to arrive so we can make sure that your words are recorded in our video archive. So if you really want to be a part of history, wait for the mic. Okay.
Just going to toss it back there.
No, we got it.
There you go.
I apologize in advance. I haven't read or listened to your book yet, so I'm not sure if you addressed this. But in your book, do you talk about what the Democrats are doing all of this time to, like, what the other side, and how it's just was like a tsunami, it seems, a wave? So just curious about that.
Yes, I do. So the Republican Party is the main focus of the book because I'm writing about conservatism and the party, but it's important what is happening with the Democratic Party. And think about something like immigration in the 1990s. Both the Republican and Democratic parties are moving pretty sharply to the right. They diverge a little bit. So on issues like Proposition 187 in California, that had the support of Republican politicians. Democrats didn't quite go all the way there. But the reason for not going all the way there is because one of the main provisions of Proposition 187 had already been struck down by the Supreme Court. So it was already an unconstitutional provision, so they could get out of it that way. But the Democratic Party was building more border wall. They were moving very sharply to the right on immigration restriction. Dianne Feinstein in California moved well to the right. And it's also pretty important for a chapter that I have on Newt Gingrich, who is somebody who came into office as a bomb thrower and a polarizer, but when he found himself Speaker of the House, he really wanted to get some things done. And he was able to work with someone like Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton was a more centrist model of Democrat, and they agreed on some ways that the government should be changed. But the problem was that Gingrich found himself outflanked from his right by a group within the House that called themselves the True Believers, and who were constantly challenging Gingrich's attempts to do any kind of governing, just as Gingrich had been challenging Reagan's attempts to do governing. And so it matters how the Democratic Party is positioning itself, because that is in play with how the Republican Party is changing at the time.
My question has to do with the role of ideology versus pure capitalism. I've been watching the series on Rupert Murdoch and his family. It seems pretty clear that Murdoch was not really an ideologue. He was just a capitalist who found a good way to make money by setting up Fox News and other similar types of businesses. And also, Trump himself is pretty clearly not an ideologue. He just uses ideology for convenience at any particular point in time. So I would like to hear you comment on what kind of mixture is going on here on the conservative side, and how much is really ideology and how much is just done for other purposes.
This is such a great question, because the 1990s are a really interesting mix of both ideology and profit motive. Because on the one hand, you do have this movement happening, particularly in Congress, to sort of batten down the ideological hatches. It's in the 1990s that the term rhino, Republican in name only, becomes kind of the watchword of the decade, the slogan of the decade, which was meant to push out moderate Republicans and liberal Republicans, the ones that were still left, so that the party would become a conservative party. Now, that was in tension with the politics of the era, because, 1992, what's happening? You have Bill Clinton running, George H.W. Bush running, and Ross Perot. And 20% of Americans are voting for Ross Perot. So you have this big chunk of the electorate up for grabs that isn't ideological. And so you have somebody like Newt Gingrich, who is both trying to cater to an increasingly ideological Republican base, but also trying to win over those Perot voters, which gives him a bit of a split personality during the early 1990s. But on the profit motive question, it's especially important when it comes to conservative media. So my first book, Messengers of the Right, looked at how conservative media activism developed between the 1940s and the 1970s. One of the things that we know about conservative media in those decades, it never turned a profit. There was no money to be had in doing this. And so you had people who had ideological commitments to right-wing politics, but didn't have to worry about advertisers or profit motives. There's a little bit of it, but not very much. When Rush Limbaugh comes on the scene in 1988, when his show becomes national, and it becomes, by the early 1990s, this unprecedented phenomenon in radio, the thing that he brings to the table is evidence that conservative media can be wildly profitable. He's not only on hundreds of radio stations with millions of listeners, he suddenly has best-selling books, he has a television show that Roger Ailes is producing, and suddenly people realize that there is money in conservative media. Rupert Murdoch realizes there is money in conservative media. Roger Ailes, who had been pushing a conservative agenda for a long time in Republican politics, realizes that there's a real opportunity in both the rise of cable, but also in making money off of this. And that actually scrambles conservative politics in some ways because it messes with the incentive structure. Now it's not just about ideological purity, it's not just about winning elections, now it's about also making a great deal of money. And that mixes things up. And I think that it is at least partly responsible for the transformation you pinpoint with Donald Trump. That you have a conservative movement that in the 90s seems to be moving in a much more ideological direction, that seems much more about ideological purity, but by 2016 has transformed into a party that's much more about loyalty. And certainly by 2022 is about loyalty to a personality rather than loyalty to an ideology. And that's a fascinating transformation. It's a fascinating transformation. Do you want to start this way?
Yeah, I'll let him start over there.
Okay.
First, I just want to say thanks for the book because I really struggle with a lot of historians who write straight-line histories from Goldwater to Trump, and it doesn't always make sense to me. So thanks for this because this really helps clarify. And my question is actually not something you addressed directly in the book, but I'm interested in understanding the term establishment Republican. And I'm interested in how that changes during this period of time. So what and who are establishment Republicans at the time of the Reagan Revolution as opposed to what establishment Republicans are at the time of Trump, either people or institutions?
So this is great because it changes, as you rightly pinpoint. In the 1970s and 1980s, establishment Republicans are people who've held office for a while, and most of them tend to be moderate and liberal Republicans. They're people like George Romney. They're people like Nelson Rockefeller, who are seen as these establishment Republicans and not conservatives, not these conservative revolutionaries. What's so interesting about the period, so you can see a little bit of it in the 1990s, but certainly by the 2000s. At that point, not only is the Republican Party almost entirely conservative, there aren't really moderate and liberal Republicans left, but there is now a real conservative establishment. And when you have a populist movement running up against a real establishment, suddenly that becomes a target as well. So the Republican establishment or the conservative establishment or establishment Republicans in the 2010s are people like Richard Lugar, who is a conservative. They're people like Mitt Romney, who's a conservative, that there's now a conservative establishment that people are in revolt against. And it's not necessarily that they've been in office a long time. I think that the establishment Republicans of the 2010s, the 2010s, really are defined by their moderation in personality and their moderation in tactics. So their willingness to work with the other party, their unwillingness to throw punches, it becomes much more about affect than it is about particular policies.
Can I do anything?
You just talking to
Okay, a dual question. Bringing in the evangelicals and the anti-choice into the conservative Republican Party that made have you commented on that in the book and the huge difference that will make in the right-wing movement, bringing in the evangelicals through with the men, bringing in through the anti-choice movement and the defeat Roe?
Yes, the anti-choice movement is particularly interesting in the 1980s and 1990s because you have the moral majority, which is founded in the late 1970s and dissipates at the end of the Reagan era, that is moving abortion into a litmus test position within the Republican Party. So in 1980, when Ronald Reagan runs for president, he makes George H.W. Bush give up his pro-choice position in order to join the ticket. In 1984, Ronald Reagan becomes the first and only sitting U.S. president to publish a book, and it's a book called Abortion in the Conscience of a Nation. So abortion politics had moved front and center when it came to Reaganism, and it moved front and center because of anti-choice activists, and in particularly Reagan's attempts to win over conservative evangelical Christians. The 1990s get kind of interesting because of the Perot factor. Ross Perot was pro-choice. So was Colin Powell. And so in the mid-1990s, Ralph Reed, who's the leader of the Christian Coalition, kind of the replacement for the moral majority that had gained real power. By 1992, more than half of the delegates to the Republican National Convention were members of the Christian Coalition. So they had enormous power. And yet Ralph Reed in 1996 at the Republican Convention is trying to soften the language on abortion, because he's trying to figure out how to make this a bigger tent party. That gets shut down very quickly by Pat Buchanan, and the Republican Party continues to hold a very hard line when it comes to abortion. But because of all those changes that were happening, there was real energy by activists to tie the party to a strictly anti-choice position. So you see, in 1981, Ronald Reagan appoints Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court. Evangelicals are not happy about that. I should say evangelicals, Mormons, and Catholics. So Christian conservatives aren't happy about that. And a year later is when the Federalist Society is founded. And one of the big points of the Federalist Society was to appoint what they saw as constitutional judges, but also judges that would overturn Roe v. Wade. And so by the end of the 1990s, you were locked into this idea that there can be no wiggle room on abortion within the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party becomes more tied to the pro-choice position by the end of the 90s as well. But what's so interesting about that period is that the line of the day was that the Christian conservatives were dupes, that they were being taken advantage of, that they were voting for Republicans so that they could ban abortion. And what were they getting? They were getting tax cuts, but nobody was doing anything about abortion. But of course, what was happening at the local and state level. And the rollback of abortion rights was happening there much more rapidly after 2010 in that wave election. And then ultimately, it, again, trickles up from the local and state level to the Supreme Court and ultimately to Dobbs.
Thank you for the program. Deidre Williams. This is going to be a little bit of a segue to the pro-choice movement. You mentioned Emily's List, which for those that are not familiar is a pro-choice PAC from a political perspective. I've been a member of Andy's List in Dallas, which is also a pro-choice feminine PAC. I've never seen something analogous on the right, and they've actually approached me on several occasions on the right to do something analogous on the right. Was there that type of movement? And why I'm asking is because when you look at the people that you focused here, particularly from the women, very few of them, with the exception of this woman here and Chenoweth, were politicians. So did the right ever look at doing something from a political standpoint to empower women, or has it always just been through pundits like, well, Shapley and all the other ones?
It takes a very long time, and one reason, especially in the 1990s, that it's taking a very long time is that there are almost no women in Congress. There are a few Republican women. They're almost all moderates, and so now they're out of step with the party. And then there are Democratic women. It's 1992 before women get the right to wear pants on the floor of Congress. We are talking about a time period where there just isn't very much representation, and we would look back on it today and be like, that seems pretty retrograde. So there wasn't a big push initially to find Republican women to hold office. The Susan B. Anthony list, I think, is that now sort of a...
They're not really active.
Yeah.
Because I've talked to those women, and they say no one really asks them to run, and when they do run, they find very little support.
And this is actually something that you hear from Black Republican candidates as well, that they, this is actually the midterm election is the first time that Black Republican candidates feel like they're actually getting financial and institutional support from the party, because the party has a problem with seeming undiverse, both in terms of gender and race. And so now they're like, oh, okay, so we can put some money towards these candidates. But that's exactly right. I mean, Elise Stefanik in the 2018 election said that she was recruiting. She wasn't recruiting people, but she was finding women who were running and then sort of like bringing them into the fold. So they've been very, very far behind on that because it hasn't been a priority for the party.
So I'm going to take the privilege of the final question, if you don't mind. And it's an unfair question. And it's unfair because, as everybody is aware, Nikki did us the great honor of having a seminar for our graduate students and our postdoctoral fellows last night. So we've already been discussing this for several hours. And I want to start off by my question by saying, I agree with your conclusion. The point...
It gets worse and worse.
Yeah. The conclusion that the end of the Cold War takes off the guardrails and allows for a greater level of hyper-partisanship, a greater level of hyper-rhetoric, and so on both sides. I think more so on the right than on the left during this period, but for both sides. So my question is, we know that that's chronologically true, that the Cold War ends, and then throughout the 1990s, the guardrails seem to fall away, and the country seems to move in a more partisan and divisive manner. How do we know that it's causal? How do we know that the Cold War's end is actually related to that change, and it isn't just a matter of circumstance and timing?
Well, I think that one way, I mean, if we're thinking, for instance, of Pat Buchanan, and I like to use him as an avatar because he's such a clear example of the Cold War coming to an end and him being like, oh, thank God, we don't have to do this anymore, and having this kind of return to an old right that really had been suppressed by the Cold War. And I think that we see this not just in terms of partisanship and divisiveness, but the Cold War really did act as a constraint on U.S. politics, and in ways that people laud and in ways that people dislike. There's a lot of disagreement around it, right? The Cold War helps to, for instance, bring along the Black Civil Rights Movement because it puts it in a conversation about U.S. morality, U.S. righteousness in the world, and how well the U.S. is living up to its values. Not all Americans come along on that journey, but it really does transform American politics, and I think help with the passage of things like the Civil Rights Act, the Immigration Act of 1965, which were about transforming the country, but were also about messaging in the Cold War. So much of what conservatism was from the 1950s to the 1980s was conditioned by the Cold War, and we know that not by looking at the end of the Cold War, but by looking at the beginning of the Cold War. That what the U.S. right looked like in the 1930s and 40s fundamentally transforms in the 1950s. So the fact that it starts to shift back at the end of the Cold War seems to be a pretty good signal that that big geopolitical reality was changing something fundamental about the right. And so I think that that's the way that I would get at it, is not just how politics are changing in the 1990s, but how are they changed from the 1930s and 1940s. And I would say the same thing is true about that kind of commitment to democracy, as complicated as that was during the Cold War era. In the 1930s, there were plenty of Americans who were eager for dictatorship. There were plenty of Americans who were attracted to fascism and authoritarianism and autocracy. And World War II does a lot to push that off of the map. But it really does take the Cold War to fully push it off, because it puts it at the center of the American project. So that's how I would begin to answer that. But of course, it is a giant question.
Well, and a good answer. In fact, I lied, because I'm going to ask another question. So I can't count the number of times a week someone asks me, are we currently in the worst political moment in American history? So now I want you to be on the spot to answer that question.
No. No, look, we're not. The United States has been through tremendous trials throughout its history. There was a little civil war in the 1860s, which seemed like a pretty big deal. But also, the thing that we're fighting over feels a little different. We talked about this last night as well. The U.S. as a multiracial democracy started in around 1965. Before that, what we were fighting over was something different. It was still a democracy, but it was a much more exclusive and exclusionary one. So we've had a taste now of a times functioning multiracial democracy, and now that's under threat, as is the liberal democratic order the world over. And that's terrifying. And there are reasons that we keep reaching back into the past for analogous moments, that we reach back to the 1930s, that we reach back to the 1850s, because it's a very bad moment. And there's a lot at stake. And there are things at stake that the US never had before, that we finally had a little taste of, and now there's a real fear that it's going away. It's why people are talking about Reconstruction so often, because I think that many people who didn't necessarily understand before what it was like to have a taste of freedom and guarantees of freedom and to have them stripped away, look back to the 1870s and 1880s and look at how Black Americans who had finally been freed from enslavement and promised all of these rights, and for a while there was biracial governance in the US South, and it goes away. And how heartbreaking that is, but how the fight didn't stop. And that, I think, is actually inspirational, right? We're at a very difficult time, and we keep drawing these very horrific political analogy or historical analogies, but there's hope in those analogies as well, which is something that I think about in the wake of the Dobbs decision, and as somebody who recently moved to a state where I have many fewer rights as a woman, that, it's bad, not great, getting worse, but it's not the worst that it's been, and it doesn't mean that it's hopeless, and that's the direction we're going forever.
Please join me in thanking Newt. Let me suggest, in fact, let me flat out say, this is a really good read, and it's really worth getting, and conveniently, there are copies just outside. So we're going to hustle you out the side so you can sign some copies, and I do encourage you to pick one.